Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Nicole Cain. I'm an assistant professor at American Public University, as Daniel just told you all. I'm going to present my research study, and he mentioned my title already. So we will get into that. So I saw a need to kind of get into this topic. I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, and I gathered most of my data in 2019, so things have shifted a little bit since then, but there was a recruitment and retention problem. It was a persistent issue in law enforcement organizations. Positions were remaining vacant and fewer people were attracted to the profession. The purpose of my study was to understand the differences between generational cohorts and specifically the millennial generation's motivation for entering and remaining in the law enforcement profession, as well as their satisfaction with their choice. So I wanted to identify hygiene and motivational factors for millennial police officers because I felt like that would assist leaders in developing strategies to recruit and retain officers. Leaders in law enforcement are seeking innovative approaches to recruiting and retaining police officers for future generations. Hiring and training an officer is timely and very costly. So developing an effective plan to recruit, hire, and retain the most qualified candidates is paramount to sustain law enforcement. Law enforcement leaders must be committed to identifying and employing the best qualified candidates available and not just eliminating the least qualified. The benefits of effective recruitment and retention policies are manifested in lower rate of personnel turnover, fewer disciplinary problems, higher morale, better community relations, and more efficient and effective service delivery to the community. So just quickly, I used Hertzberg's two-factor theory of motivation and hygiene, and it's based on a series of studies conducted in the 1950s, which surveyed workers and identified sources of satisfaction and dissatisfaction in their job. And you can kind of see the dissatisfiers there and the motivators on the slide. This theory delineates between satisfaction and dissatisfaction and suggests that the employers must address both. Hygiene factors include adequate pay, benefits, job security, decent working conditions, supervision, interpersonal relationships. Hygiene factors do not necessarily satisfy or motivate, but they set the stage for motivation. And then motivation includes achievement, recognition, responsibility, the work itself, advancement, and the potential for growth. So what are the contributing factors to this recruitment and retention issue? And again, I collected my data in 2019 and conducted my research for the literature review during 2019, a little bit in 2020. So at that time, a strong economy was a contributing factor because generally speaking, when the economy is good, people tend to go out in the private sector rather than the public sector for work. Perception of increased danger of police work, not only officer-involved shootings and officers getting hurt by criminals, but also increased suicide rate among police officers. And then, of course, the poor image of policing. So the hiring process is another issue I really dived into. It is a tedious process, and it's designed to eliminate candidates rather than adopting policies that proactively identify and hire positive. And the selection process is long. It can take up to 6 months. The training, once you're selected, there's a police academy. And then once you get on the job, there's often 4 to 6 month training period too. So it can take over a year to hire and train a police officer. So part of the study too, I had to dive into some generational research. According to the research, generational cohorts are influenced by geography, demographic changes, cultural shifts, political events, economic fluctuations, and global conflict. These contribute to a person's worldview. And based on my research, this is how I delineated the different generations. Baby boomers are born from 1946 to 64. Generation X were born from 1965 to 1980. And then the millennial generation describes people born from 1981 to 1996. Another topic I really wanted to get into, and this was part of one of my research questions, was leadership. And I found that the number one internal factor affecting an employee's decision to stay or leave a job is the relationship with their immediate supervisor. Oftentimes people leave because of supervision, leave their work. Transactional leaders operate in a structured hierarchical environment with strict rules and regulations, which is very much like the paramilitary organizational structure of a law enforcement agency. And certain situations in policing require transactional leadership, but if a matter of practice, and this is what I found through my research, a more integrative approach using both transactional and transformational leadership styles is necessary within law enforcement. And transactional leadership is more of a people-oriented model. It empowers people, it inspires people, motivates employees to commit to the vision, values, and goals of the organization. So my methodology for this study was broadly non-experimental, quantitative, and survey research. My sample was broadly non-probability by sampling size, purposive in nature, and convenient by definition. The sample of the participants were identified through access to a master list of 240 sworn law enforcement officers with the Lakeland Police Department. The population sampled for this study was an aggregate of 240, and the overall participation rate was 99. I essentially used survey format, and there were 4 demographic questions and then 11 5-point Likert scale items, 5 representing the strongest level of agreement and 1 representing the strongest level of disagreement. The piloted studied survey was created first to 36 randomly selected members, and just to test the internal consistency, and then those were included in the study itself. No adaptations were made to the piloted survey. This is my preliminary analysis. And this is how I grouped. Obviously, one of the demographic questions was age. So I was able to put the age based on what I knew about the dates of birth for the different generations that I mentioned before. And this is this was my return. I had 37 millennials, 55 Generation X, and only 7 baby boomers. So for the purposes of this study, I didn't include the baby boomers because they just weren't significant enough as far as numbers. Research question number 1, I focused on Millennial and Generation X's satisfaction with their career choice. And you can read the question there. And I found that for millennials, it was statistically significant. And here you can see it. So, and for Generation X too. They both were satisfied with their career choice. You can see there the mean average for millennials is 4.27, and then for Generation X, 4.44. And then my second question focused on leadership. To what degree do millennials perceive the leadership style of those in supervisory positions within the department has inspired them to remain in a career in law enforcement? And same with Generation X. And again, for millennials, it was significant. The average was 3.81, and for Generation X, it was 3.27. And back to the first one, the difference wasn't statistically significant between the two. But here it was statistically significant. So millennials value leadership a little more than the Generation Xers. But again, leadership is important to both. My third question was about training and handling stressful situations and community relations. Mean score was 4.22, and the difference was not statistically different between the two generations, between millennials and Generation X. And here you can see the chart. And this was one of the most interesting questions. Considering the participant perception of sense of mission, professional respect and esteem, and role in removing criminal influences from the community, which represents the most, prominent correlate and predictor of overall satisfaction with the decision to pursue a career in law enforcement. And for millennials, it was sense of mission, very strongly sense of mission. And for law enforcement, for Generation X, it was professional respect and esteem. That's a big difference between the two. And here you can see the chart. And again, I thought it was valuable to know that millennials really like that. they were drawn to the profession for that sense of mission. Research question number 5 was about hygiene factors, salary benefits, career advancement opportunities, and work schedules. For the millennials, career advancement and work schedules emerged as the most prominent predictor. And for Generation X, it was work schedules, which again is a difference. And it's important to understand those differences as you lead through this recruitment situation. And then again, you can see the chart. And my 6th research question was considering the most prominent predictors within the domains of hygiene factors, which were the ones I just talked about, and then the motivational factors, which represents the most prominent correlate and predictor of overall satisfaction with the decision to pursue a career in law enforcement. And for millennials, sense of mission emerged. It was the most important reason why the millennials entered law enforcement and remain in law enforcement. So as I kind of went through these results and what that means to law enforcement, I found that for the first research question, both generational cohorts, millennials and Generation X, were satisfied with their decision to pursue a career in law enforcement, which aligned with some of the current generational research that I had conducted. So once we get them there, they tend to enjoy the profession. So we have to get them to the profession first, right? The results for the second question indicated that millennials were inspired by the leadership style of their supervisor to remain in the profession more so than Generation X. And again, generational research really shows that millennials, they need that supervision, that guidance, that you're doing a good job and that sort of thing. The results demonstrated that millennials value leadership. So law enforcement leaders must continuously adapt their leadership styles to motivate. You got to motivate millennials and retain changing workforce demographics. Police leaders must also realize that employees rarely leave agencies. Again, they leave supervisors. So millennials favor leaders who allow them to participate. Again, that's a significant result, because I also found that in the research about millennials. They want to be involved. They want to participate in decision making. They want to utilize their critical thinking skills. We have to allow them to encourage, we have to encourage personal growth and provide immediate feedback. Absolutely. Millennials grew up with phones in their hands. They're used to immediate feedback. They're used to Google results and kind of that fast food mentality. So the results for the third research question indicated that both generational cohorts, millennials and Generation X, were satisfied with their level of training. As the demographic shift, leaders must monitor the composition of their workforce. Millennials value career development, expecting training and educational opportunities to continuously enhance their knowledge base and remain marketable. There was a study conducted by the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, and they found that 85% of respondents reported implementing professional development opportunities to improve retention. And that's certainly going to help retain your millennials and future generations as well. The fourth research question indicated that millennials consider the sense of mission in serving the community an essential motivational factor in pursuing a career in law enforcement. They seek meaningful work and desire to help people. And my results showed that, and also some of the research I had done on the different generations revealed that. The results indicated that Generation X participants identified the variable professional respect and esteem as the most prominent motivational factor, predicting the overall satisfaction. So that's different. That's a big difference between millennials and Generation X. So research question number 5 showed that both generational cohorts, millennials and Generation X, identified work schedules as the prominent hygiene factor in predicting their satisfaction with their decision to pursue a career in law enforcement. And millennials also identified career advancement. And again, I found that to be true. It aligned with the research I had been conducting. They like the idea of training, of career advancement. So that's something that leadership needs to keep in mind. The results for research question number 6 indicated that millennials Overall satisfaction with their career in law enforcement is primarily based on their sense of mission, serving the community. So what does this mean for future practice? Law enforcement leaders should evaluate the needs of their respective department by conducting a staffing analysis. It's valuable for law enforcement leaders to consider what constitutes an ideal candidate for their organization and the community, and to address internal, external, and relationships with the community before implementing any recruiting or retention initiatives. So for an agency, what is an ideal candidate? You can determine that on the needs of your agency, on maybe the demographics of your community, and then maybe who are some of your best performers? Maybe identify them and what traits do they have in common, and determine kind of what is that ideal candidate. Police executives should ensure that they are conveying the right message about police work and ensuring that potential recruits are receiving the message. Okay, so that's important. What are we telling people about law enforcement, and are they getting it? Are they getting the message? A key takeaway is that millennials did not identify their role in removing criminals from the community as a motivational factor in pursuing a career in law enforcement. Often, police recruitment literature, brochures, videos, internet ads highlight specialty units, fast-paced action, and dramatic scenes, neglecting the other more prevalent aspects of the policing profession. As a result of this study demonstrated, millennials are interested in serving the community and potentially are more attracted to community service and public engagement opportunities that a police career can provide. The results show that they also value training and career advancement opportunities, so it's valuable to highlight them, to highlight the opportunities. It's valuable to ensure that these components of the profession are included in recruitment initiatives. So we have to maybe change how we're, again, showing what police do. What message are we sending to potential recruits or candidates? So in conclusion, findings from these studies are intended to assist leaders in developing strategic recruitment and retention tactics to improve the current workforce crisis. Police agencies must be committed to identifying and employing the best qualified candidates available, not merely eliminating the least qualified. Understanding hygiene and motivational factors for millennial police officers will assist in this endeavor. And the rest of my slides are references. So I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. We will now have Professor Charles Chuck Mclean, who is from the School of Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice at the Metropolitan State University. And Charles will be speaking about the social contract and the ethics of police tactics. So I now pass the floor to Professor Mclean. Charles, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel, for the invitation, and thank you to your team for setting all this up. I sure appreciate that. And thank you to Dr. Cain for her amazing presentation, very insightful, and I appreciate it. Last time I presented at the ICC was in 2019, and at that time I presented my quantitative analysis of public confidence or civilian confidence in local law enforcement. This time I really am coming to you with a lament, a dream, and a quest. And I hope you'll go along with the path, and I sure thank you all for attending.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. A video making the rounds on social media shows a Minneapolis police officer threatening a young man during a traffic stop.
He and his friends were ordered out of their car and then put in handcuffs. They were never arrested, though. Fox 9's Jonathan Cho following this story for us tonight with more on the investigation.
Kelsey, the men inside the car are of Somali descent and say they were racially profiled. They're also raising concern about simple police etiquette. When officers ordered him out of the car, this young man hit record on his smartphone. And here's what he captured.
Plain and simple. You're going to break your leg before you get a chance.
Well, I'm from the Twin Cities area in Minnesota, and I teach just north of Minneapolis in Brooklyn Park. I suspect, though, that many of you are as familiar as I am with the people pictured here who were involved in the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And that has to do with, and the reason why I show that is to really explain my lament and really explain my dream and to really illustrate my quest. We need to do better. It's as simple as that. And I track it back to the social contract. I mean, we compel officers to take an oath to the United States Constitution, to uphold and to defend the Constitution. We imbue them with an obligation to serve and to protect, but we also authorize them to lie and cheat and deceive and use the magic pen to rewrite history in their reports and to hide their true motives and to drive up stop and arrest rates. How do we authorize and empower them to do that? Because that's what the US Supreme Court has granted. And we tell them to exhibit selflessness and to adhere to the social contract for all. But we also tell them, you know, it's really about teleological ethics and utilitarian ethics and the greatest good for the greatest number or the greatest net good. And the greatest net good will always elevate majority preferences over minority rights. It makes it simple in a utilitarian sense, to run roughshod over minority communities, because that's what some of the majority want. Not in my neighborhood, not driving by my house. I don't want to see it. Get them off the street. Shut that down. And the US Supreme Court plays a role in this by balancing when it decides on people's individual constitutional rights and how and whether they'll be enforced. The US Supreme Court balances those constitutional rights as part of that social contract against the likelihood that it might impair or impede law enforcement work. And I think that's just wrong. Furthermore, I think from an officer's perspective, it's hopelessly schizophrenic and utterly unconstitutional. And that's the scene that I want to share with you. The social contract goes back to 17th and 18th centuries with Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, that the government has its right to exist and its power to govern by the consent of the people. That's the social contract. The people say, okay, government, I'm creating you, I'm giving you these powers, but in exchange, you give me something. Well, in the creation of the United States government, that was the process of creating the United States Constitution, where we'll give you a series of, the federal government, a series of powers, executive, legislative, and judicial. But we're nervous about you because we just came from the crown that was overbearing and solitary power. And we don't want that. We're willing to create a federal government, but only subject to strict controls. And so that's the quid pro quo that happened in the Constitution is we'll give you Article 1, 2, 3 that creates the government, but you have to give us, or we're not going to ratify the Constitution, Amendments 1 through 10, and later Amendment 14. The promises of liberties, the promises of protections against compelled self-incrimination and protections against unreasonable searches and seizures is part of the quid pro quo. If the government continues to honor those promises in the Bill of Rights, then the government retains its right to govern, its legitimacy. But when the government, through its police officers and other officials, fails to honor those protections fully, then it starts to erode the legitimacy. It starts to erode the power of the government to govern, in my view. Again, this is my lament and my dream and my quest. During the ratification process, the colonists made it clear, we will agree to this powerful federal government only if you include that Bill of Rights. The Constitution would never have been ratified without it. So they should be viewed as one piece, as the social contract. And I'm going to talk about just several pieces of that social contract, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, and 14th Amendments, just briefly, and kind of take a look at that schizophrenic nature, that unconstitutional, in my view, nature of the way that we charge our law enforcement officers with enforcing the most important law that they have to enforce, which is the supreme law of the land, the Constitution. But here's what we get instead. We get officers who say, well, as a law enforcement officer, I don't owe anything to the people I deal with on the street. I'm the one with the badge. I'm the one with the gun. Or we get officers who say, oh yeah, I always carry a drop gun when I go into those neighborhoods, you know, just in case. Or, well, he shouldn't have run. Of course I had the right to shoot him. He was fleeing. Or I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Shoot first and let God sort it out. Or I'm always scared going into black neighborhoods. They're all thugs and druggies. Or I'm sick of running into foreign languages in America. If you're going to be here, speak English. Well, all of those statements by law enforcement officers, actual statements, compare them up against why those officers have the power of arrest, why they have a badge, why they have a gun. They have it because of that social contract that the people in effect gave up their rights to seek revenge, to seek, to form posses, to create feuds, and replace that with a criminal justice system intended to be equitable and fair and just to all equivalently, not to some, but not others, not to the majority, but not the minority, but equivalent protection and service to all. And I query and I lament whether officers saying these sorts of things are capable of doing that or willing to do that. For a bit of background, I teach both criminal justice ethics and constitutional criminal procedure, and frankly, I can no longer connect the two. They are internally inconsistent. In fact, as I teach constitutional criminal procedure and explain the US Supreme Court's decisions on the Bill of Rights to my students who are future law enforcement officers, it often seems like it has more to do with how to sidestep those promises, that quid pro quo, than how to enforce it. And as I dig more deeply into constitutional analysis and try to fit ethics into it or try to tease ethics out of it, what I see is less and less jurisprudence and more blunt force majority rule without any leavening from the social contract. And the social contract, in my view, should provide more than just leavening. It should provide the base, should provide the guarantee. It is the promise. It is the contract between the people and their government. So when you hear my examples coming up shortly, I would ask you to set aside business as usual. Imagine a new post-George Floyd US law enforcement landscape, post-Roberts Court jurisprudence landscape, where the watchword has become Constitution as contract, where law enforcement protects and serves all and the Constitution, and where ethical legalism no longer thrives. Ethical legalism being, well, anything that's legal is therefore less ethical, which of course is ethical fraud. So let's take a look at first at consent searches. The Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. That's the quid pro quo. That's part of the quid pro quo. The second clause of the Fourth Amendment has to do with warrants. And one of the exceptions to the warrant requirement is where there is consent from the subject whose property or person is being searched. But the court has held routinely that deceit is just fine in even misleading a subject into consenting to a search. Think about the implications of that. I have a constitutional guarantee to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures that shall not be violated. But officers who act on behalf of the government can deceive me into giving up that right. And that's been regularly approved and reapproved by the US Supreme Court. In Schneekloth versus Bustamante, it's not necessary when seeking consent for officers to advise the subject of his right to withhold consent. Well, why not? Yes, that's the law. That's still the law, but why not? In Miranda, of course, we talked about notice of your right to remain silent before custodial questioning. We require notice of your right to counsel before custodial questions, but we don't require that sort of notification before seeking consent. So they're supposed to be honoring this social contract, and yet can so easily, with the US Supreme Court imprimatur, avoid it. Or when an officer secures consent to search by deceiving the subject is just deemed to have assumed the risk that he would be betrayed. From Bumper versus North Carolina. Well, why is that? Why is it reasonable? Because that's the word they hang their hat on in the Fourth Amendment. Why is it reasonable to so cavalierly avoid the Fourth Amendment implications of withholding or granting consent to search? And think of what that deception means. You're holding yourself out as a law enforcement officer as something else. If you held yourself out as a law enforcement officer, you would not have been granted consent. But if you masquerade as something else, then that's perfectly fine. Because, you know, the subject is deemed to be running that risk. Really? Seems to me that the social contract should mean more than that thin fabric. Just a few of the examples, co-conspirator informants certainly can yield consent by misrepresentation, undercover officers, purported friends, undercover drug buyers, undercover gamblers, undercover meat buyers. An officer can go up and feign car trouble. Why? To get into the house. Well, sure, come on in and stay warm. And then while they're in the house, they are searching with their eyes that house without actually, facially, frontally, honestly seeking consent. And that's been blessed by the Supreme Court. Or alleged letter carrier walking up to the door. Do you mind if I step inside? Sure, because you're a letter carrier. Come on in. They would never have let a law enforcement officer in, but that deceit is blessed. And so the supposed bulwark of this quid pro quo of the social contract fades yet more. And the Department of Justice has provided the bottom line for us. Therefore, it's advisable to devise a deception when you're misleading the public into consenting to a search that might routinely be experienced by residents in the ordinary course of events. That's instruction from our United States Department of Justice to law enforcement officers. Here's how to deceive. Go ahead. It's fine because the US Supreme Court has said so. Even though the social contract, that fabric, that bulwark that's supposed to protect us, I don't know. Criminal culpability flows to civilians who lie to the police, but not vice versa. Query whether that sort of inconsistency, that police are free to deceive, but people are not, whether that inconsistency is part of the problems with confidence, civilian confidence in police. You know, Thurgood Marshall probably had it right, at least in my view did, when he said, in my view, good police work is something far different from catching the criminal at any price. It's equally important that the police, as guardians of the law, fulfill their responsibility to obey its commands scrupulously. Well, amen. Or under the Fifth Amendment and Miranda, no person should be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's the quid pro quo. That's the social contract protection. And a person in custody being interrogated must first be Mirandized. So the question is, what's custody and what's interrogation? And that's all been analyzed by the courts. But the courts have also held that if you have somebody in custody and you put somebody in there to be his cellmate who is working with the police or is a police officer undercover and start asking the inmate questions about the crime, that doesn't violate Miranda. Well, it's certainly custody. They're in jail. It's certainly interrogation. That plant is asking the inmate questions, but that's just fine. More deceit, more deception, more erosion, in my view, of the social contract. And they held Miranda forbids coercion. That's all, not mere strategic deception by taking advantage of a suspect's misplaced trust in one he supposed to be a fellow prisoner. Deception's fine. Or in Oregon versus Matheson, employs to mislead a suspect or lull him into a false sense of security that do not rise to the level of compulsion or coercion to speak are not within Miranda's concerns. So of course they hang their hat on this compulsion, but the problem with hanging your hat there is this, that if under Matheson or if under Perkins, a statement is obtained through deception from this suspect, this subject, what are they going to do with that statement? Well, they're going to put it before the jury at the trial. Compelled self-incrimination. If I have your statement and it's been blessed by Matheson or Perkins, I'm going to bring that statement in as evidence against you. You're compelled to allow me to do that. That is compelled self-incrimination. And I'm a 20-year prosecutor, ladies and gentlemen. But I'm concerned that that is the kind of erosion that we cannot maintain or ought not. You can falsely tell a subject that his cousin's already confessed and implicated him in the crime. That's completely false. Why do you tell that subject that? Well, you tell him that to get him to confess, to get him to give up his right to remain silent. If we do that, then what happens to right to remain silent? It becomes a mirage. Or in cases that flowed after Fraser versus Cupp, you see all kinds of situations where officers falsely claim this and that when they're interviewing someone. And they don't do it just to tell stories. They enjoy telling stories. They do it because they believe it will mislead the person into giving up their right to remain silent. Well, that's not consistent with that social contract. And there are implications to that, as identified by the National Registry of Exonerations, that 29% of all convictions that were later exonerated by DNA were due to false confessions, often resulting from deception. There are people in prison because of this deception. Real world consequences that's blessed by the courts. And it's easy to just kind of wave that off as, well, that's not a problem for me, it's a problem for those who commit crimes. But imagine any of us in a small room, suspect in a serious crime, being held basically incommunicado from friends and family, sometimes from lawyers. The pressure must be enormous. And that pressure can lead and deceive some into giving up their right to remain silent. They're afraid, and rightfully so. Is that the way that contract is supposed to be interpreted? Or the 14th Amendment, no state shall make or enforce any law which abridges the privileges or immunities of citizens, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, nor deny to any person the equal protection of the law. But Black people in this country, in the United States, are more than twice as likely as whites to be disadvantaged throughout the criminal justice system. including all of these circumstances: traffic stops, searches during traffic stops, gang enhancement sentencing, stop and frisk policies, deportations, police shootings, SWAT deployments, asset forfeiture, solitary confinement, bail, release conditions, jury service, transfer to adult court for juvenile offenders, arrest, convictions, sentence length, sentencing departures, prison commits, capital punishment, probation and parole status, parole release rates, felon disenfranchisement, drug war, plea bargaining, diversions, and I could continue the list. That so far violates equal protection with a protected class that it's absurd that we continue to hold ourselves out as adhering to this social contract when in fact it's just tatters at this point, in my view. And you can see the implications of it here, where civilian confidence in the police actually mirrors that 2-time racial disparity I just showed you in the last slide, where Blacks are 2 times as likely to suffer criminal justice disparities as whites. And this chart here shows their confidence is roughly half. Black confidence is roughly half what white confidence is. And that's been consistent throughout. In fact, the picture after George Floyd is much worse, much worse. And they have a right to not have confidence. The law enforcement officers in this country and the prosecutors and the judges and everyone else involved in the criminal justice system should be adhering scrupulously to that social contract and not ignoring it or sidestepping it so cavalierly, and with the support of the court. Eight shots, white officer, Black man in the back. Thank God for the video, which allowed justice to happen in that case. And then turn your eyes toward excessive use of police force, which really has implications for the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable seizures. And you can see here from a 2018 study of 2015 data, the Department of Justice found 1 million people had suffered what is deemed to be force in these interactions with police, 48% plus of whom found it to be excessive. And you can see when it separates out white from Black that it is 2 times or more greater for Black persons to suffer force and excessive force than white persons. So query the social contract, the 14th Amendment, the equal protection fabric of protection, whether that really still pertains. And looping back then to what I would say the lore of use of force by US police, which use more force than virtually any other police force in the world. And you can say that that's an outgrowth of the frontier spirit or the Second Amendment right to bear arms or what have you, but it is the highest. I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Shoot first and let God sort it out. When you shoot, shoot center mass. Shoot until the threat is eliminated, until the threat is dead. Shooting the subject in the leg is bad policy and unsafe. Anyone can kill you at any time, so you need to be on guard. Black people are just predisposed to violence. We have to bend the rules to beat those who break the rules. First we ask, then we tell, then we make. Ask, tell, make. These US police lore items of use of force are wrong. I can tell you that when we look back at law enforcement and criminal justice policy 25 years ago, we look back with disdain. What were they thinking? How could they imagine that that's justice? But I promise you that 25 years from now, those that follow us will look back at our time, at this, with disdain and say, what were they thinking? How did they possibly imagine that that was justice, that that was consistent with the social contract? Excessive use of police force and the Fourth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. Black persons in Minneapolis, Minnesota are 19% of the population and 58% of use of force incidents. In Charleston, Black people are 22% of the population and 61% of the use of force incidents. In Texas, Black persons are 12% of the population, 29% of the deaths in custody. For every one officer shot to death by a civilian in the United States, 18 civilians are shot to death by an officer. About 1,000 civilians are killed every year by US law enforcement officers. Unarmed Black people are 3.5 times more likely to be shot by police than unarmed whites. And all the DOJ has had since Attorney General Janet Reno's time, an initiative to collect better data on use of force. Still today, only 27% of law enforcement agencies even report use of force incidents. So I ask, is all that consistent with the social contract? So sure, it's my lament. Sure, it's a dream. I promise you it's my quest. A new tomorrow in US criminal justice. As I've identified here, protect and serve instead of oppress. Honor the Constitution instead of creatively sidestepping it. Truly achieve procedural justice on every shift. Deliver equitable results by race and by other classifications. Demilitarize local police. De-escalate and disarm law enforcement responses. Increase the length of law enforcement officer training. We have the shortest period of pre-service training of all developed nations for law enforcement, particularly training related to de-escalation and cultural celebration. Eliminate rewards for stops, for searches, for collars, for arrests. Stop deceiving civilians into waiving constitutional rights. In my opinion, that would all better honor the social contract and would all better reflect the quid pro quo that the people in their government should honor every day.
Thank you, Professor McLean. These were a couple of very interesting presentations related in some ways. While Professor Cain spoke about generational comparison of motivators for entering and remaining in the force, Professor McLean gave us some of the many reasons why people simply don't trust the police. And it gives us a feeling that it's not just one thing, or there isn't just one easy to follow strategy, but it seems like a very complex multitude of issues. And we don't know even who should be in charge of leading the steps towards any sort of reform or change. We have a handful of questions, a couple of general questions and a more specific one. The first question from Jacob Smith: what would be some of the most immediate things that police officers and departments might do to improve the perception from the community at a time of high distrust, especially from younger generations?
If I could weigh in on that, I think this is where the two presentations dovetail almost perfectly. That it really does end up being a recruitment and training issue. There are many officers in law enforcement today who are wonderful officers who live the Constitution every moment, who only seek justice every day on every shift. And I've worked with hundreds of them. And it's the honor of my life to have worked with them. But there are many, especially now older officers, who are old school, who remember the long elevator ride in the Chicago Police Department high rise, who believe that we have to break the rules to enforce the rules. And they're not kidding. They truly believe that. So the recruitment solution rests in recruitment choices that lead toward selecting new officers who live the dream, right? Who live this quest, who understand and honor the constitutional requirements, not just what the courts let them get away with, but that ethics truly drives them, not ethics of a utilitarian sense where it's just the greater good and we're going to run roughshod over minorities, but ethics in the sense of virtue, of doing the right thing every time. So I think it's about, we just need to replace and eventually attrit out those who get older and are out of the business, but we've replaced them through time with better officers, more ethical officers who we then advance and promote and ensure that kind of top-down mapping of ethical decision-making every day. I think that's one of the key solutions is recruiting. For immediate solution, I think it's about making a difference now. Don't be so anxious as a law enforcement officer about somebody with a phone recording you. You should be making every decision as if your mom was on your shoulder. Okay, you should be making every decision the right way. And for the most part, in my view, the recordings, audio and video, have helped officers more than hurt them anyway. So that's a quick rundown.
Thank you. Nicole, I'm not sure if you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think transparency is key. I am a fan of body worn cameras. Do you think that they help law enforcement? I think some of the cell phone video footage we see is taken out of context or is only a small part of what occurred. And we have body worn cameras and surveillance footage from maybe businesses, and we get a bigger picture, and we put that out as far as the leaders in these organizations put the information out to the people. So I think transparency is the biggest thing, and certainly hiring. We have to hire ethical, honest police officers. And I can't speak for every agency in the country. I can speak for Florida agencies. Our police academy is around 5 months long. And then, like I mentioned in my presentation, the training on the job is extensive as well. College degrees are encouraged. I mean, I think that always is beneficial. So, I mean, certainly we need to be in a better place because we draw our members from the community. And if the community is hesitant or mistrustful or doesn't like the police, then it's difficult to recruit. Another thing I think is important is when I mentioned analyzing the needs of the agency, that includes demographics. Ideally, the police department should mirror the community. One of the stats, I can't remember if it was, maybe it was Minneapolis, it was 58% Black. Try to get 58% of your, or around that, members of your police department. I think that helps too, to have a better pulse on the community. And I think that builds trust. So it's about trust. Community-oriented policing is a good philosophy too. Police agencies are kind of drifting that way, which is excellent. So definitely there's things that we can do better in law enforcement.
Thank you. We have another question from Karen Lancaster Ellis. Do you think the police deceptive tactics is a result of their inability or shortcoming in their investigative capabilities and intelligence gathering efforts?
If I could respond to that, my sense of deception is that it's lazy. And since it's been enabled, it's a path. and officers want to pick any path that makes sense. So for example, when new technology is developed that allows officers to listen to conversations happening inside a house from 3 blocks away, well, officers are excited to use that technology. And the court doesn't catch up to it until 6 years later and finally says, well, don't do that because that's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. I don't blame officers for trying to use any port in the storm. It's busy. They're tough to solve these cases. And so it's not just laziness. They're grabbing at straws. They're finding any resource that they can find. But I've also seen officers who, old-fashioned shoe leather, I guess, and I'm an old enough guy to talk about shoe leather, that they work their butts off. They will turn over every stone. They'll talk to every neighbor. They'll do everything they can and avoid, frankly, deceiving because of the distaste, even though they know it'll be authorized by the courts should it get that far. That's not how they want to do business. And that's not how they see the constitutional oath that they took. So yeah, there's great investigations out there and great investigators out there, and I've worked with many of them. My sense is that there are a lot of very poor ones. I remember one example where, if any of you remember the CVSA period, where it was a voice stress analyzer, where they could hook somebody up, a suspect up to the voice stress analyzer, a little black box, and it would identify from the voice whether that person was exhibiting stress. And this particular officer I'm thinking of would hook up the sexual assault victim reporter to that CVSA. And if they exhibited some sort of deception, they would just say, well, unfounded, and move on. Lazy. That's lazy. That's not an investigation at all. And so, it depends on, it's a potpourri. I think it's about leadership. I think it's about who's doing the investigation and who's driving the investigators as to how good the investigation really is.
Thank you. We have another general question also from Jacob Smith. As we just learned from Minnesota, voters rejected a measure to replace the police department, which indicates that perhaps that was not the route most people wanted to take. In lieu of replacing the police, what might be some of the measures that might be put on voters to decide in regards to police change?
There are great changes happening all over the country. In Baltimore and Washington, D.C., they're tending to put multidimensional teams out instead of just law enforcement response for critical incidents. They're sending therapists as well, or social workers and so on. And I think that's a wonderful move in the right direction. I don't support defunding at all, and nor do most people in reality. In fact, probably, 96% of the people, including those in areas with high crime rates, because they want the protection. They need the help. They want to make sure that they're safe too. What we really need is procedural justice, not in the buzzword sense, but procedural justice, that if you are a suspect, you get the sort of justice that the Constitution requires. If you are a victim, you get the sort of attention and the voice that you deserve as having, more interest in this case than anybody else. That's what people are really looking for. And I think it's really about training, retraining, discipline approaches, leadership that truly lives and models ethics. That's what people, and when I did my dissertation, I did it on the mirroring concept that Dr. Cain talked about. And I fully expected my research to show that African Americans want their local law enforcement agency to mirror them, to look like them. Well, in fact, my dissertation showed the opposite, or not the opposite, but at least inconsistent with that. What African Americans wanted, according to my quantitative research, is they want procedural justice. They don't care what the color is of the person who's doling it out. They want to be treated fairly, and they're sick and tired of being treated unfairly. If it's a white person, black person, white officer, black officer, blue officer, they don't care. They want justice. And so I'm not sure mirroring, although that a lot of agencies strive in that direction, and there are certainly advantages to mirroring in terms of sensitivity to community issues and so on, but it's not the panacea.
Okay, we have another question from JL. Please give examples of rewards for stops, searches, and collars.
Well, certainly there are advantages to being an aggressive law enforcement officer. You get the attaboys, you get to be called out at the squad meeting. Well done, well done. And those people who get those attaboys and those well dones and commendations and whatnot are those who are likely better positioned for advancement and therefore are likely to be rewarded for that activity. What I think should happen instead is more attaboys and more rewards and more advancement for those who are community sensitive and outreach driven and end up at the boys club and girls club and help get kids turned in the right direction. That's where the attaboy should be. That's where the rewards should be, as opposed to the number of tickets.
Okay, we have one more question. Often we talk about training, but aren't the most influential trainers on the ground? Most great trainers are promoted out of these positions. Perhaps revising pay structure and advancement of officers would keep those who like to supervise and train on the ground with new recruits. Promotion seems to be disabling the best from mentoring new recruits. What are your thoughts?
That's an excellent point, and I think right now it's even a bigger issue because we have a lot of officers leaving. Baby boomers are exiting the profession. Generation X are kind of in the rank positions. So you have new officers training new officers. That's an issue. Maybe rather than promotion, maybe training officers, it could be a bit of a promotion, maybe not like a rank position, but a position that earns prestige and maybe a financial benefit or something like that to entice people to remain in a training position, like a field training officer, rather than getting promoted. Because the thing with being promoted is it's rank and it's a financial promotion. So I think that's why a lot of people do it, and to be a leader and to guide the troops and stuff. But it's an issue now. There is no question. We have 2-year officers doing training, and it's simply because our agency is and not just my agency, but agencies throughout the country have new officers, again, because the officers are leaving or we're having trouble bringing people in. But I think that's a great point. Training is certainly a factor for sure.
All right, thank you. I don't see any more questions and we're running out of time. So thank you, Professor McLean, and thank you, Professor Cain, for these both very interesting presentations. And thank you to our attendees. We hope we will see you in the next panels.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks, everybody.